The hall was filled with voices from every corner of the world. Flags from dozens of nations lined the stage, and the sound of simultaneous translations whispered through the earpieces of the delegates. It was one of those international gatherings where leaders, thinkers, and representatives came together to talk about the future of humanity. Cameras flashed as journalists prepared to report each word, knowing that some statements would travel instantly across the globe. Among the speakers that day was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a figure who carried a famous family name and a long tradition of American politics. People leaned forward as he walked to the podium. His voice, calm but firm, filled the room as he began his speech. He spoke about democracy, about the importance of values, and about the unique role the United States had played for decades. Kennedy paused for a moment, looked at the audience, and declared, "We lead the free world." The words hung in the air. For some, they felt comforting, like a reminder of an old promise. For others, they sounded like an echo from the past, a phrase that had been repeated so many times that its meaning was no longer clear. Delegates exchanged glances, some nodding with approval, others tilting their heads in quiet doubt. Kennedy continued, explaining how America had stood as a defender of liberty through wars, crises, and political storms. He spoke of alliances, shared struggles, and sacrifices made in the name of freedom. His tone was not arrogant but proud, as if he was carrying a torch passed down from earlier generations. Yet in one corner of the hall sat a man listening closely, his expression calm but thoughtful. Ibrahim Traoré, the young transitional president of Burkina Faso, had traveled far to be here. Unlike many others, he was not surrounded by a large team or a crowd of advisors. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a soldier who had stepped into leadership during a time of turmoil at home. As Kennedy's words reached him, Traoré remembered his own childhood. He had grown up in a country where the word freedom often came with limits. His people had seen decades of promises from outside powers, promises of aid, security, and partnership, but life for many villagers remained the same, difficult, uncertain, and bound by the invisible chains of dependency. When Kennedy said, "We lead the free world," Traoré wondered what that meant for nations like his. Was freedom something shared equally? Or was it a title reserved for those who had power to define it? The room gave polite applause as Kennedy finished his speech. The cameras followed him as he stepped down, shaking hands with diplomats and smiling at the crowd. For most, the moment would have ended there, just another official statement at another global meeting. But for Traoré, the words called for a response. He knew he was not expected to speak after Kennedy. Younger leaders, especially from smaller countries, often had limited space in such conferences. But Traoré was not one to remain silent when something pressed heavily on his heart. Slowly, he rose from his seat. His movement caught the attention of those around him. The microphone was offered, and he accepted it with a steady hand. The hall grew quiet. People were curious. Traoré was not a household name like Kennedy, but in recent years his bold positions in Africa had drawn attention. He had spoken openly about sovereignty, about the right of nations to shape their own destiny without being told what to do. Now, in front of the world, he prepared to speak again. His eyes scanned the room, not with anger but with firmness. He began in a voice that was steady and clear, a contrast to the polished tone of the earlier speech. He acknowledged Kennedy's statement, then posed his own question. "You say you lead the free world," he said. "But is it by keeping others in chains?" A silence spread across the hall. It was the kind of silence that falls when someone dares to say what many have thought but never voiced. For Traoré, those words were not meant as an insult but as a mirror. He wanted the world to reflect on the reality of his continent, where leaders often spoke of independence but lived under the shadow of decisions made elsewhere. To him, freedom was not about slogans or titles. It was about whether a farmer in Burkina Faso could sell his crops fairly, whether a child in a remote village could go to school without barriers, whether natural resources could be used to lift his people out of poverty rather than leaving them dependent on outside loans. The delegates looked at one another, some uneasy, others moved. It was clear that this exchange was more than a debate between two men. It was a collision of perspectives, one shaped by decades of global leadership, the other by centuries of longing for dignity and equality. Kennedy, sitting back in his chair, listened without interruption. He was seasoned enough to know that leadership often meant being questioned, even challenged. But Traoré's words touched something deeper. They were not merely political, they were personal, rooted in lived experience. The moment would be remembered because it was rare, a young African leader standing face to face with a Western figure and daring to ask whether freedom, as defined by the powerful, truly included everyone. Outside the hall, reporters were already typing furiously, sending updates to their newsrooms. Some framed it as a clash, others as a dialogue, but all agreed it was significant. The phrase "keeping others in chains" would appear in headlines, sparking debates on talk shows, social media, and in the homes of ordinary people. Inside the hall, the session continued, but the air was different. People no longer listened with passive ears, they were alert, questioning, aware. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. As the day ended and delegates moved through the corridors, whispers followed. Some admired Traoré's courage. Others dismissed him as too bold, too direct. Yet even those who disagreed admitted that he had spoken words that could not easily be forgotten. For Kennedy, the challenge was clear: the role of America as leader of the free world was not unquestioned. For Traoré, the message was simple: true freedom cannot exist if some nations prosper while others remain bound by invisible chains. And so, what began as a routine speech at an international forum became the beginning of a story that would echo far beyond that hall, a story about leadership, freedom, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. The hall slowly returned to its rhythm after the striking moment. Delegates whispered to each other, some still unsettled by the unexpected question raised by the young leader from West Africa. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the atmosphere around him was not new. He had spent most of his life in places where people spoke quietly about injustice, where truth was often expressed in hushed tones rather than loud speeches. Traoré's story did not begin with podiums or international spotlights. It began in the small, dry villages of Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in the heart of West Africa. Life there was shaped by the rhythm of the sun, the rains, and the soil. Children walked long distances to fetch water, farmers tilled land that often yielded too little, and mothers stretched every grain to feed their families. As a boy, Ibrahim had seen both the beauty and the hardship of his homeland. He loved the wide open skies and the sense of community where neighbors cared for one another, but he could not ignore the struggles of daily survival. His country was rich in natural resources, yet poor in living standards. Foreign companies dug deep into the ground, carrying away gold and minerals, while many villagers remained without electricity or proper schools. These contradictions shaped him early. When his teachers spoke about independence from colonial rule, he would wonder why so much still seemed dependent on outside powers. The textbooks spoke of freedom, yet his people often had little control over their own future. As a young man, Traoré joined the military. For him, it was not only about discipline or career, it was also about service. He wanted to protect his country from threats, both inside and outside. The uniform gave him authority, but it also gave him a chance to see more of the world beyond his village. In the military camps, he met men from different regions of Burkina Faso, each carrying stories of villages where opportunities were scarce, where youth dreamed of a better life but had few chances to pursue it. These conversations stayed with him. They reminded him that leadership was not just about commanding soldiers, but about carrying the voices of the forgotten. By the time he rose into politics, Traoré was not just a soldier. He was a man shaped by both tradition and change. He had seen how aid programs arrived with conditions attached, how local leaders often acted under pressure from stronger nations, and how promises of partnership sometimes felt more like instructions. This background gave weight to his words at the International Forum. When he asked Kennedy whether leading the free world meant keeping others in chains, he was not simply speaking from theory. He was speaking from experience, from the years of seeing foreign influence in Africa that often left people feeling less independent, not more. But what kind of chains was he talking about? For Traoré, they were not made of metal. They were chains of economics, chains of dependence, chains of systems that kept his people tied to decisions made elsewhere. Consider the fields of Burkina Faso, where cotton is grown in large quantities. Farmers worked hard under the hot sun, yet the price they received for their crops was often dictated by international markets far beyond their reach. By the time the cotton left Africa, it passed through many hands, increasing in value. Yet the farmer who bent his back in the soil remained poor. Or think of gold, a resource buried deep in Burkinabe land. Mines were often run by foreign companies, contracts signed under unequal terms. While wealth left the country, the local communities near the mines struggled with pollution and poverty. The chains were invisible, but they were heavy. Traoré had also seen how security in the region was managed. Foreign military bases, often established in the name of fighting terrorism, sometimes felt to local people like reminders of old colonial presence. Many wondered if true safety could only be built by relying on outside powers. These were the thoughts that shaped him as he sat quietly during Kennedy's speech. While the words "we lead the free world" sounded noble, he could not forget the mothers he had met who still walked miles for water, the students who studied in classrooms without light, or the farmers who received so little for so much labor. Was this truly what freedom looked like? To the outside world, Traoré's rise to leadership seemed sudden, but to his people, it was a continuation of his life's path. He had stepped into a moment when Burkina Faso needed new direction. Many citizens felt tired of being told what democracy should look like, tired of depending on loans that deepened debt, tired of policies shaped elsewhere but lived at home. As president, even in a transitional role, Traoré began to speak openly about sovereignty. He reminded his people that freedom was not just about having a flag or a national anthem. It was about being able to make decisions without waiting for approval. It was about using their own resources for their own benefit. It was about dignity. In meetings with villagers, he would often listen more than he spoke. Elders told him stories of the past, of how communities survived together, of how respect for land and tradition had once been central. Youth told him of their frustration, of how they wanted to build but felt blocked by lack of opportunity. From both, he heard the same longing, the desire to stand tall, to be truly free. This was why the moment with Kennedy mattered so much. It was not a personal challenge, not a desire to embarrass. It was a statement on behalf of those who rarely got a microphone, those whose voices were often lost in the noise of international politics. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper. Kennedy came from a family known for its role in American history, a symbol of legacy and influence. Traoré came from the villages of Africa, a soldier who had risen not through dynasty but through determination. Kennedy spoke from the stage of a superpower, Traoré spoke from the lived reality of a nation still finding its path. And yet, in that hall, their voices met. One claimed leadership of the free world, the other questioned the cost of that leadership. In the days that followed, people in Burkina Faso watched the news with pride. Many felt that their president had spoken words they had long carried in their hearts. They knew that change would not come overnight, but they were encouraged to see their struggles acknowledged in such a visible way. For Traoré, the journey was far from over. He carried with him not only the title of president but also the weight of expectation. Every word he spoke was measured by his people, every decision judged by whether it brought them closer to true independence. But he remained steady, guided by the memory of where he came from. His background was not of luxury but of hardship. And it was that background that made him speak the way he did, simple, direct, unafraid. Because for him, the meaning of freedom could not be decided in conference halls alone. It had to be lived in the daily lives of ordinary people. The air inside the great hall seemed to pause when Ibrahim Traoré asked his question. His words had not been shouted, but they carried a weight that silence could not ignore. By keeping others in chains. The phrase echoed, not because of volume, but because of its truth. Everyone present understood that it was more than a rhetorical question. It was a challenge, a mirror held up to history. For a few seconds, no one moved. Delegates glanced at each other, unsure of how to react. The journalists, however, were already alive with excitement. Pens scratched against paper, fingers tapped on keyboards, and cameras zoomed in to capture the face of the man who had dared to say what many only whispered behind closed doors. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. sat calmly, his expression controlled, but his eyes revealed thought. He was used to public debates, used to being questioned. Yet this moment felt different. It was not a debate with another politician from his own country. It was a confrontation with a perspective shaped thousands of miles away, in a world often spoken of but rarely listened to. Traoré continued, not in anger, but in steady reflection. His words were measured, his tone respectful yet firm. He spoke of how Africa had contributed so much to the world but had often received little in return. He spoke of countries that were rich in minerals, oil, and fertile land, yet their people remained poor. He questioned why partnerships often looked like dependency, why loans arrived with strings attached, and why military aid sometimes created more fear than safety. Delegates leaned forward, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The young leader's words were not wild accusations, they were lived realities for millions across the continent. You speak of freedom, Traoré said, looking directly at Kennedy, but freedom is not real if it is given with one hand and taken with the other. Freedom is not real if nations are told what to do, how to govern, and who to depend on. Freedom must be equal, or it is only a word. The room fell into another silence. His question had now become a statement, one that could not be dismissed. Kennedy, when given the chance to respond, chose his words carefully. He acknowledged the concerns and reminded the audience of America's long-standing belief in democracy, human rights, and the defense of liberty. He pointed out how the United States had supported movements around the world, how it had often stood as a barrier against oppression. His voice carried sincerity, as though he truly believed in the noble mission he described. But even as he spoke, the hall felt different. Traoré's question still lingered, shaping the way people heard Kennedy's words. Where some once heard only pride and tradition, now they also heard echoes of responsibility and accountability. Outside the hall, the world reacted instantly. News networks ran breaking headlines, African leader challenges Kennedy at global forum and freedom or chains. Debate shakes international gathering. Social media buzzed with clips of the exchange. Some users praised Kennedy for standing by America's role as leader of the free world. Others praised Traoré for voicing the frustrations of the global south. In cafes across Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, citizens watched the replay with pride. Elders leaned closer to the television screens, nodding at their young leader's courage. Students, who often felt their voices carried little weight, shared the clip online, saying, "He speaks for us." Taxi drivers, market vendors, and farmers discussed the moment as if they had been in the hall themselves. But it wasn't only in Africa that people were talking. In Europe, commentators debated whether Kennedy's phrase still fit the modern age. Was the world truly led by one country anymore, or was leadership now shared among many voices? In Asia, newspapers analyzed the growing confidence of African leaders who no longer stayed silent. In Latin America, people drew parallels to their own history of questioning foreign influence. The clash of words had become more than personal. It was symbolic of a larger shift. For decades, the phrase leader of the free world had gone unquestioned. It had been accepted as part of the political vocabulary. But now, a young man from a landlocked African country had asked the world to reconsider what those words truly meant. Inside the forum, the discussion moved on to other topics: climate change, economic development, technological cooperation. Yet the earlier exchange colored every new subject. When leaders spoke of partnership, they were reminded of Traoré's words about chains. When they mentioned aid, they thought of his questions about conditions and dependency. Traoré himself sat quietly after his statement. He was not interested in dominating the event. For him, speaking truth was enough. He did not need applause to know that his words had landed. The silence in the room had told him everything. Kennedy, too, remained thoughtful. Though he defended America's role, he understood that leadership was not simply about claiming authority. It was about listening. And in that hall, he had been forced to listen to a perspective often overlooked in global discussions. That evening, as delegates left the building, the conversations in the corridors were not about official resolutions but about the exchange between Kennedy and Traoré. Some said it was the beginning of a new dialogue between North and South. Others said it was a reminder that the world was no longer as simple as it once seemed. For the journalists, the story was gold. They reported not just on the words spoken, but on the expressions, the pauses, and the reactions in the hall. They described the moment as historic, not because of anger or conflict, but because of honesty. For the ordinary citizens watching from afar, the story carried hope. It showed that even a young leader from a small nation could stand in front of the world and speak truth with courage. It reminded them that leadership was not only about power but also about dignity. The clash of words, though brief, became a turning point in the forum. It shifted the tone of the entire gathering, forcing everyone to reflect on what it truly meant to be free. And so, part 3 of this story was not about arguments or winners. It was about awakening. It was about the world hearing, perhaps for the first time in such a direct way, that freedom cannot belong to a few if it leaves others behind. That night, as lights dimmed in the city, people carried with them the memory of that question. A question so simple, yet so deep: by keeping others in chains. It was not just a question to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it was a question to the entire world. The exchange between Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Ibrahim Traoré had already left its mark, but the story did not end in that hall. In the days that followed, their words traveled far beyond the conference stage. Newspapers, television anchors, radio hosts, and social media platforms picked up the dialogue, turning a few minutes of conversation into a global discussion. In Washington, commentators debated whether Kennedy's phrase "we lead the free world" still reflected reality. Some defended it, saying America had earned the title through decades of commitment to democracy, humanitarian aid, and international alliances. Others wondered if it was time for the world to move away from the idea of a single leader. Maybe, one writer suggested, the free world should be led by cooperation, not by one flag. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the reaction was different. People spoke with excitement about their young leader. At tea stalls, in buses, and in open markets, citizens repeated Traoré's words proudly. By keeping others in chains, became more than a question, it became a slogan. Youth painted it on walls, student groups quoted it in their meetings, and musicians began turning it into lyrics. For many, it symbolized a new kind of confidence. Africa was not afraid to speak for itself anymore. Traoré himself kept a calm profile. He did not flood the media with interviews, nor did he repeat his statement again and again. Instead, he returned to his people, focusing on the work waiting at home. His decision to remain humble only strengthened the respect he earned. The world had seen his courage, but his people saw his heart. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Kennedy faced his own wave of responses. Some critics accused him of being too traditional, of repeating old language that no longer fit a changing world. Others argued he had shown grace in listening and responding without anger. In interviews, he acknowledged the importance of Traoré's perspective. He said, "Leadership is not only about speaking, it is also about hearing voices that challenge us." This balanced reply impressed many. Though Kennedy stood firmly by his belief in America's role, he showed that he was willing to reflect. And in doing so, he helped turn the heated moment into an opportunity for dialogue rather than division. The ripple effect continued. Think tanks organized debates around the meaning of freedom. University students wrote essays comparing Western ideas of liberty with African experiences of independence. Even in villages far from big cities, people who rarely discussed international politics began asking questions: what does it mean to be free? Who gets to decide the meaning of freedom? In Africa, especially, the impact was profound. Leaders from other nations, inspired by Traoré's courage, began to speak with more confidence at global meetings. They pointed out how development aid could sometimes weaken local industries, how natural resources were often exported cheaply while imported goods drained local economies. They questioned the idea that freedom could be measured only by elections and parliaments, suggesting that true freedom must also include control over land, water, and wealth. Journalists noticed a trend. They called it the new voice of the South. Commentators explained that for years, many nations had quietly accepted the language of international diplomacy. But now, younger leaders were no longer willing to accept terms without discussion. They wanted fairness, respect, and dignity. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré visited schools and community gatherings, speaking not of his international recognition but of the simple goals that mattered most: better education, clean water, food security, and a future where young people could dream. He reminded them that one speech in a faraway hall would not change their lives overnight. Real change, he said, would come from the work they did together as a nation. Still, his people could not hide their pride. For the first time, one farmer told a local reporter, "I feel like someone carried our struggle into the ears of the world." The story of the exchange grew like a seed, planting new thoughts in unexpected places. In Latin America, activists quoted Traoré when demanding fairer trade. In Asia, community leaders compared his words to their own history of fighting for independence. Even in Europe, where some initially resisted the critique, many young people admitted that the African leader's honesty had touched them. The ripple effect also reached classrooms. Teachers used the debate as an example of how one voice can make a difference. Students role-played the dialogue, practicing not only how to defend a position but also how to question it. In this way, the story became a lesson in critical thinking, in courage, and in respectful disagreement. The most powerful impact, however, was not in politics or classrooms. It was in the hearts of ordinary people who felt seen. For decades, many communities across the global South had felt invisible in the grand speeches of world leaders. Now, with a few words, Traoré had reminded them that their reality mattered too. Meanwhile, Kennedy's reputation did not weaken from the challenge. In fact, for some, it grew stronger. People admired that he had not dismissed Traoré or reacted defensively. Instead, he showed patience and respect. His willingness to stand by his belief while recognizing another perspective gave the story balance. It showed that real dialogue was possible between the powerful and the less powerful. This balance became the true beauty of the moment. It was not simply about one man questioning and another defending. It was about the possibility that leadership and humility could exist in the same space. It was about the recognition that freedom, if it is to mean anything, must be shared, not owned. Weeks later, when the Forum officially released its final report, the exchange between Kennedy and Traoré was not mentioned in the technical documents. Yet everyone knew that it had been the heartbeat of the gathering. The official words spoke of partnership, progress, and shared goals, but the unofficial memory was of a young African leader daring to ask whether those promises were real. And that memory lived on. It lived in headlines, in conversations, in classrooms, and in the quiet determination of people who wanted their freedom to be respected. For Traoré, it was never about winning an argument. For Kennedy, it was never about losing face. It was about sparking a necessary question in a world where leadership had often been taken for granted. The ripples of truth spread far and wide, touching places neither man might ever see, reminding humanity that freedom is not a gift to be handed down but a right to be lived equally. When the forum ended and the delegates returned to their countries, the words spoken inside that hall continued to travel. They were not just words between two men, they had become part of a larger conversation about freedom, leadership, and dignity. In the weeks that followed, people everywhere found themselves reflecting on the meaning of those moments. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. carried with him the weight of his family name, the long history of American leadership, and the belief that his country had stood for liberty across decades. His words, "We lead the free world," were meant to inspire. They came from a place of pride, from a tradition that had guided much of international politics since the mid-20th century. Ibrahim Traoré carried a different story. His life had not been shaped by global speeches or alliances, but by the daily struggles of his people in Burkina Faso. For him, freedom was not an idea in a textbook or a phrase repeated at conferences. Freedom was about whether a child could eat before going to school, whether a farmer could live from his land, whether a village could dream without waiting for permission. His words, "by keeping others in chains," were not simply a reply. They were a reminder that freedom cannot be real if it is unequal. In many ways, the two men represented two different eras. Kennedy symbolized the older vision of leadership, one nation standing as the guide for others. Traoré represented a new vision, many voices demanding respect, equality, and partnership. Their exchange was not about who won or lost, it was about showing the world that leadership is changing. Commentators began calling it a clash of perspectives. Yet those who listened carefully realized it was more than that. It was also a meeting of truths. Kennedy's truth was that America had indeed sacrificed and stood for freedom in many moments of history. Traoré's truth was that those same freedoms often felt distant in places like Africa, where chains of poverty, debt, and dependency still existed. This dual truth made the moment powerful. It was not simply a debate where one side was right and the other wrong. It was a mirror showing that the world is complex, that freedom is not one-dimensional, and that leadership must evolve. As days turned into weeks, more people reflected on what it meant for their own lives. In Africa, many felt encouraged to speak with more confidence. They believed that their leaders could now question global systems openly. In America, some citizens paused to ask whether their country's role as leader of the free world was still a fair description, or whether a new language was needed, one that respected the equality of nations. Students in universities discussed the event in their classes. They asked, "What does it mean to lead? Is leadership about guiding others, or is it about listening and supporting? Can there be a world where leadership is shared, not claimed?" Professors encouraged them to think of freedom not as a single path, but as many roads walked by different people. In Africa's rural villages, the story was told in simpler words. Elders explained to children that their president had spoken to a man from a powerful nation and reminded him that respect must be mutual. Farmers spoke of how they wanted their work to bring real benefits to their families, not just profit to companies abroad. For them, Traoré's courage was not about politics, it was about dignity. In the United States, Kennedy's supporters emphasized his calm response. They admired that he did not dismiss the African leader's words, but listened respectfully. They saw this as proof that leadership is not only about speaking but also about allowing others to question. Critics, however, urged American leaders to rethink how they used the phrase "leader of the free world," warning that it risks sounding outdated in a more connected and equal world. What became clear was that the exchange had sparked a movement of reflection. People realized that freedom cannot be described only by those who already have it. It must also be described by those who are still seeking it. And leadership cannot only be about giving speeches, it must also be about creating space for others to speak. For Traoré, the aftermath was humbling. He did not act like a man who had won a great victory. Instead, he continued his work quietly at home. He visited villages, encouraged young people, and spoke about responsibility. He reminded his citizens that words alone do not build schools or hospitals, action does. But he also reminded them that words can open doors. His question to Kennedy had not solved poverty, but it had opened the world's eyes a little wider to their reality. For Kennedy, the exchange also left a mark. In later interviews, he admitted that global leadership must adapt. He acknowledged that voices from Africa and other parts of the world must be heard more. He did not abandon his belief in America's role, but he softened it, showing that leadership must be more about cooperation than command. This balance between pride and humility, between tradition and change, made the story lasting. It was no longer only about two men on a stage. It was about the entire world learning that freedom cannot be owned, only shared. Months later, when people remembered the forum, they did not recall the technical reports or the official agreements. They remembered the question. A simple question that cut through long speeches and formal language. By keeping others in chains. That question became a symbol of honesty in diplomacy, a reminder that even in polished halls, truth can be spoken plainly. In the end, the lesson was clear. Leadership is not proven by declaring oneself leader. Leadership is proven by listening, by respecting, by creating a world where freedom is not a gift handed from one to another, but a right lived by all. For the people of Burkina Faso, the story brought pride. For the people of America, it brought reflection. For the rest of the world, it brought hope that the global conversation could finally become more equal. And so, history will not remember the event as a clash, but as a turning point. A turning point where the old idea of one nation leading gave way to the possibility of many nations sharing. Where the meaning of freedom was questioned not to divide, but to deepen understanding. The final reflection is simple: freedom cannot exist if some walk ahead while others remain tied. True leadership is not about keeping the title of leader. It is about making sure everyone has the chance to walk freely. In that hall, with one question and one response, the world was reminded that chains are not always made of iron. They can be invisible, woven into systems, agreements, and assumptions. But they can also be broken not by force, but by honesty, courage, and dialogue. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the moment, that in speaking his truth, a young leader from Africa reminded the world that freedom must belong to all, or it belongs to none.